blood on her dress, a dead man on the desk, and her cousin standing over the body, wiping the blade clean, looking at her with eyes that held no more feeling than a man settling an account. He gave her 3 days: marry a killer or hang for a murder she did not commit. Clara Whitfield chose neither. She ran 2,000 miles into the mountains of Montana, answered a stranger's advertisement for a wife, and walked into a cabin where 3 brothers and a dying child were waiting for someone exactly like her. What happened next would cost her everything she had left and give her everything she never thought she would find. Now let me take you back to the beginning. The blood had already soaked through the front of her dress before Clara Whitfield realized she was screaming. It spread across the pale blue fabric in a dark crimson bloom that would never wash out. That would mark her forever, as surely as the image now burning itself into her memory. Silas Green slumping forward across the mahogany desk, the bone-handled letter opener buried to its hilt between his shoulder blades. The slow, almost peaceful way his hand slid off the ledger he had been reading and hung limp at his side. And Herbert standing beside the desk with no more expression on his face than a man brushing lint from his sleeve. Herbert withdrawing the blade with one smooth pull and wiping it clean on Silas's jacket, the gesture practiced and unhurried, as though this were simply another task to be completed before supper. Herbert turning to look at her, those calculating eyes, that voice utterly stripped of emotion. "Well now, we have a problem, do we not, cousin?" The November afternoon light filtered through the tall office windows on Beacon Street, illuminating dust motes and violence like some terrible painting hung in a gallery no one should ever visit. Outside Boston went about its business. Carriages clattered past. A newspaper boy called the evening edition. Normal life continuing, while everything in Clara's world shattered into pieces too small to ever reassemble. She could not move. Her medical training, the years of watching her father work, the hundreds of hours spent studying anatomy and physiology and the mechanisms of death, all of it told her what she already knew. Silas Green was dead. The amount of blood, the angle of the wound, the way his eyes had gone glassy and fixed on something far beyond the ceiling. There was nothing to be done. Herbert set the letter opener down on the desk, carefully avoiding the spreading pool. "You were not supposed to be here," he said. His tone was conversational, relaxed, as though discussing the weather over brandy. "Silas and I had a disagreement about certain financial records. He wanted to involve the authorities. That could not be allowed." Clara found her voice, though it came out strangled and thin. "What have you done?" "Herbert insured my financial security." He crossed to a cabinet, withdrew a bottle of brandy, poured himself a measure, and drank it in one swallow. "Unfortunately, your presence complicates matters. I cannot have witnesses. But you are family, Clara. I do not want to hurt you." He poured a second glass and held it toward her. She did not take it. "You are going to marry Marcus Blackwell." The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Clara felt her stomach turn to ice. Marcus Blackwell was 52 years old, a business associate of Herbert's, with eyes the color of a frozen lake and hands that moved too slowly over everything they touched. He had called on Clara twice since her father's death, ostensibly to offer condolences, but his gaze had lingered on her body in ways that made her feel like something being measured for a box. And there were rumors. 2 previous wives, both dead within a year of marriage. Accidents, officially. But the servants whispered different stories in the kitchens of Beacon Hill, stories about bruises hidden under high collars and screams muffled by closed windows in the night. "I will not," Clara said. She was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Herbert's expression hardened like mortar, setting between bricks. "Then I go to the police tonight. I tell them you and Silas were having an affair, that you killed him when he tried to end it. Your dress is covered in his blood, Clara. You were standing over his body. Who do you think they will believe, a respected businessman and attorney, or a hysterical woman with no husband, no money, and no standing?" The trap closed around her with the precision of a well-made lock. Marry Marcus, a marriage that would likely end in her death within months, quiet and convenient, and ruled an accident by a coroner Herbert surely already owned. Or refuse and face the gallows for a murder she did not commit. Her father had taught her to think clearly in crisis, to assess all available options before acting. But standing there in that blood-soaked office with the copper smell of death thick in the air, Clara could see no path that did not end in darkness. "I need time," she whispered, "to think." You have until Monday. 3 days. On Monday morning, you accept Marcus, or I go to the police. Choose wisely, cousin. Clara fled, down the stairs, through the front door, into the November cold without a shawl, without a coat, without anything but the dress that bore the stain of another man's murder, and the knowledge that her own cousin would kill her as easily as he had killed Silas Green if it suited his purposes. The streets of Boston blurred around her. Gas lamps flickered. Carriages rolled past. A woman in a fur collar stared at the blood on Clara's dress and pulled her child closer. Clara walked for hours, her mind churning through impossible choices until the cold forced her to stop, and the darkness showed her where she was. She stood outside the boarding house on Tremont Street where Lenora Price lived in retirement. Lenora, her father's old nurse, the woman who had held Thomas Whitfield's hand through the worst of his consumption and had wept at his graveside when the earth closed over him 3 months ago. The only person left in Boston who might still care whether Clara lived or died. Lenore answered the door in her nightgown, took one look at the blood on Clara's dress and the ash-white terror on her face, and pulled her inside without a word. Later, after Clara had washed and changed into borrowed clothes that were too large for her small frame, after she had told the whole terrible story in a voice that kept breaking and reforming like ice, on a March river, Lenore sat silent for a long moment. She was 60 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands that had delivered babies and closed the eyes of the dead, and never once trembled. Her face showed the kind of resolve that comes not from youth or strength, but from having survived enough to know that survival itself is a choice. You need to disappear, Lenore said finally. Leave Boston entirely. Start over somewhere Herbert cannot reach. Go so far that his money and his connections mean nothing. How Clara's voice cracked on the word. I have nothing. Everything went to Herbert. The house, the practice, the savings. Father left no will that named me. The law says the nearest male relative inherits. I have the clothes on my back and nothing else. Lenora stood, went to her bedroom, returned with a small leather purse and a folded newspaper. Inside the purse were bills and coins. Clara counted $40. A practical need. A rancher in the wilderness with a child who was sick or fragile or both, who needed a woman with exactly the skills Clara possessed. The skills her father had spent 20 years teaching her. The skills that no one in Boston valued because they belonged to a woman instead of a man. Write to him, Lenore urged. Tonight, tell him what you can do. If he responds, if he sends passage, you go. You vanish into the mountains where Herbert's reach cannot follow. It was insane, traveling 2,000 miles to marry a stranger based on a newspaper advertisement, abandoning every familiar thing for a life she could not imagine in a place she had never seen. But the alternative was Marcus Blackwell's cold hands on her skin or a noose. When Clara looked at it that way, insanity seemed like the only rational choice. Gone to relatives in Philadelphia. Would write with her answer about Marcus when she had collected herself. Herbert did not believe her. Clara could see it in the way his jaw tightened and his fingers drummed against the doorframe. But he could not prove the lie, and he could not search every boarding house in the city without drawing the kind of attention he could not afford. He left, and Clara breathed. The letter from Garrett Holden arrived on a Wednesday, 2 weeks and 3 days after Clara had mailed hers. Inside the envelope were 3 things. A brief note in strong, angular handwriting, $120 in bills, and instructions to reach Boulder Creek, Montana before the end of November, before winter, snows made the mountain passes impassable. The note read, Miss Whitfield, your qualifications meet my needs. I require a wife who can handle the isolation and hardships of mountain life. My daughter is 6 years old. Her health is fragile. She needs someone with your training. Come to Boulder Creek. We will wed upon your arrival. The winter here is long and harsh. Decide quickly. Garrett Holden. Not a single romantic word. No declarations of affection or promises of happiness. Just needs stated plainly in the hand of a man who apparently found economy of language as natural as breathing. His daughter was 6. Her health was fragile. He needed Clara's skills, and Clara needed to disappear. She left Boston the next morning on the 7 o'clock train. Lenora stood on the platform with her shawl wrapped tight against the November wind, her face set against the emotion that kept trying to break through. She pressed a small Bible into Clara's hands at the last moment. Your father would want you to have this, Lenora said. It was his. I kept it after he passed because I could not bear to let Herbert have it. Clara held the Bible against her chest. The leather was worn smooth from her father's hands. She could feel the ghost of his touch in every crease. The train lurched forward. Boston slid away behind her. The steeples and rooftops and gas-lit streets. The cemetery where her father lay beneath fresh earth. The office on Beacon Street, where Silas Green's blood was probably still drying on the rug. All of it shrinking, retreating, becoming smaller and smaller, until it was nothing but a smudge on the horizon, and then not even that. 2,000 miles ahead, a stranger waited. A child needed her. And behind her, somewhere in the city, she was leaving. A man with cold eyes was already making plans. Clara did not look back. 7 days on the train. 7 days watching the world outside her window transform like a story being told in landscapes. Cities gave way to farmland. Farmland gave way to prairie. Prairie gave way to foothills that climbed and climbed until the sky itself seemed to lower, pressing down on peaks that wore snow like crowns. She slept poorly. The sleeping berth was narrow and the wheels never stopped their rhythm, and her dreams were full of blood and letter openers in Marcus Blackwell's smile. She ate when she remembered to, which was not often. She read her father's Bible and found notes in his handwriting, in the margins, tiny observations about faith and doubt, and the human body's capacity to heal itself when given half a chance. She pressed her fingers against those notes as though she could absorb his wisdom through her skin. On the fourth day, she opened her father's medical kit to check the instruments and found something she had not noticed before. Tucked inside the lining of the case, hidden beneath a layer of gauze, was a small, leather-bound journal. Her father's handwriting filled every page. Dates, names, numbers. She read the first entry and felt the breath leave her body. It was an accounting, meticulous and detailed in the precise hand of a man trained to record symptoms and dosages. Every entry documented a sum of money. Money that should have been in the family accounts but was not. Money that had been moved, redirected, siphoned away over the course of 2 years. The entries traced a clear path, and every path led to one name: Herbert Marsh. Her father had known. He had spent months gathering evidence of his nephew's theft, recording every discrepancy, building a case as carefully as he built a diagnosis. But he had died before he could act. And now the evidence sat in Clara's lap on a westbound train, 2,000 miles from the man it could destroy. She did not yet understand what this journal was worth. She closed it, returned it to its hiding place in the medical kit, and watched the mountains grow larger outside the window. But the knowledge sat inside her like a seed waiting for soil. It would grow. In time, it would grow into the weapon she needed most. At the Denver station on the 6th day, Clara stepped onto the platform to stretch her legs and buy coffee from a vendor. The air was thin and cold and tasted of pine. She was lifting the cup to her lips when she saw them. 2 men in dark suits, too well dressed for the dusty platform, too purposeful in the way they moved through the crowd, scanning faces with the methodical sweep of hunters who knew exactly what their quarry looked like. One of them approached the ticket seller and held up something. A photograph. Even from 30 yards away, Clara recognized the shape of it. The portrait that had hung in Herbert's office. Her portrait. The coffee cup hit the platform. Clara did not hear it break. She was already moving, back through the station, past the baggage car where her single trunk sat waiting. She left it. Left everything she owned, except the carpet bag she carried, the one that held her father's medical kit and the journal inside it, and her borrowed clothes, and nothing else. She found the ticket office on the far side of the station and bought passage on the next stagecoach to Boulder Creek. Paid extra for immediate departure. The coach pulled out 12 minutes later, with Clara pressed against the window, making herself small, and through the back glass she saw the 2 men emerge from the station doors into the street, their heads swiveling, searching. Seconds. She had escaped by seconds. The stagecoach to Boulder Creek took 2 days over roads that were little more than ruts carved into mountain slopes by wheel and weather and the stubborn passage of time. Clara was the only passenger. Mail sacks and cargo filled the rest of the cramped interior, and the smell of canvas and dried meat and axle grease became the smell of her new life. The driver was a grizzled man named Hutchkins, who communicated primarily through grunts and tobacco spit and the occasional full sentence delivered over his shoulder with the casualness of someone discussing the price of nails. Storm-coming Hutchkins called down on the second morning. Might be the last coach through before spring if she hits hard. How far to Boulder Creek, Claire asked. 40 miles. We will make it. But it will be close. They made it with an hour to spare. The snow started falling as the stagecoach rattled into Boulder Creek, a frontier town that looked like it had been assembled in a hurry and never quite finished. One main street of packed dirt, lined with wooden buildings that leaned into one another for support. A general store with faded letters above the door. A saloon, a hotel with a crooked sign, and at the far end a small building with a weathered plank that read Sheriff. The town looked half deserted in the gathering storm. Snow already dusted the rooftops and the hitching posts and the back of a mule standing patient outside the general store. The world was turning white, and Clara was standing in the middle of it with a carpet bag and $40 in a letter from a man she had never met. A figure emerged from the sheriff's office, a man in his 50s, gray-haired with a silver star pinned to a sheepskin coat, and the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of wind and honesty into something resembling carved wood. He approached the coach as Clara climbed down her legs, stiff, her back aching from 2 days of punishment. Miss Whitfield. His voice was steady and unhurried. I am Holt Brennan. Sheriff, Garrett said you were coming. He is waiting inside the store. Clara nodded, unable to find words. This was it. The moment she had been traveling toward for 2 weeks, running toward for her life. The moment she would meet the man who had placed that advertisement. The stranger she had agreed to marry, sight unseen. Brennan studied her face with eyes that saw more than they revealed. The Holden brothers are good men, he said quietly. Different, but good. Do not let their size scare you. Brothers, the word came out as a whisper. The advertisement had not mentioned brothers. Brennan looked surprised. Garrett did not tell you there are 3 of them. Garrett, Wyatt, and Cole. They run the ranch together up in the high country. Been there about 5 years now. Built everything from nothing. 3 men. Clara almost laughed. She had fled one impossible situation and landed in another. She had expected one rancher, one stranger to navigate, one set of eyes to meet. Instead, there were 3, and the snow was falling harder, and somewhere behind her, maybe already in Denver, maybe already asking questions at the stagecoach office, Herbert's men were following her trail. Brennan led her around the side of the general store and through the back door. The store smelled of coffee and leather and kerosene. Shelves lined every wall, stacked with everything from flour to ammunition, the accumulated necessities of a town that could not afford to run short of anything. And standing near the front counter, visible through the window that faced the street, were 3 men who made Clara forget how to breathe. They were enormous. That was her first coherent thought. All 3 stood well over 6 feet, built with the kind of solidity that came not from vanity, but from years of lifting and hauling and breaking the land into something that would sustain them. They wore work clothes, flannel and denim and leather, and boots caked with the honest dirt of labor. And they stood together with the unconscious closeness of men who had spent their lives side by side and no longer needed to think about where to put themselves in a room. When Clara entered from the back, all 3 heads turned at once. 3 pairs of eyes found her face and held there, and the weight of that combined attention was like stepping into a strong current. Brennan spoke. Miss Whitfield, these are the Holden brothers, Garrett, Wyatt, and Cole. The tallest one stepped forward. Dark brown hair, eyes the color of storm clouds gathering over mountain peaks. A jaw that looked like it had been cut from granite and set with the intention of never being moved. A small scar bisected his right eyebrow, pale against deeply tanned skin. This was Garrett, the one who had written the letter, and he was even larger up close. His shoulders seemed to fill the space between shelves, and his hands hanging at his sides were the hands of a man who had spent his life gripping things that did not want to be held. Miss Whitfield. His voice came from deep in his chest, low and steady, like the sound a mountain would make if mountains could speak. I am Garrett Holden. Welcome to Montana. Clara found her voice. Your letter did not mention brothers, did not seem important at the time. His expression revealed nothing. His eyes revealed everything. Behind the granite control, behind the steady gaze and the squared shoulders and the careful economy of words, Clara saw something she recognized because she had been carrying it herself for 3 months. Exhaustion. Not the kind that came from work, though there was that too. The kind that came from grief held too long in a space too small. Wyatt stepped forward next, an inch shorter than Garrett, eyes the color of amber catching firelight. A face built for intensity, but softened at the moment by something that might have been warmth if it had been allowed to grow. He was the one who spoke next. "We owe you an explanation, Miss Whitfield, about why the advertisement came from one man, but the household holds three." Clara waited. "Our parents died when we were young," Wyatt said. "Wagon accident on a mountain pass. I was 17. Garrett was 20. Cole was 14. Garrett raised us. Found work. Saved. Built what we have. We promised each other we would never separate." Cole stood slightly behind his brothers. The youngest at 28, though he still towered over Clara by more than a foot. His eyes were an unusual green striking in the lamplight of the store, and his face held a kind of openness his brothers did not. Where Garrett was granite and Wyatt was amber coal was the one who looked like he might still know how to smile without effort. But it was Garrett who continued, and what he said changed everything. "I have a daughter. Her name is Bess. She is 6 years old." Clara felt the room shift beneath her. The advertisement had said child in need of care. She had pictured many things during the long train ride. But the way Garrett said those words, "I have a daughter," carried a weight that went far beyond the simple fact. "Her mother died 3 years ago," Wyatt said, taking over where Garrett's voice seemed to run dry. "Diphtheria. Garrett rode 3 days to buy medicine. When he came back, Rose was gone. Bess survived, but her lungs were damaged. She has been fragile since. Catches every cough. Every fever hits her harder than it should." Clara understood now. The advertisement. The specific request for medical knowledge. The urgency in the letter. Garrett Holden was not looking for a wife because he was lonely or because the law required proof of a family. He was looking for someone who could keep his daughter alive. "That is why you wrote medical knowledge," preferred, Clara said. Garrett met her eyes. Yes, one word. And in that word, Clara heard the sound of a father who had already lost one person he loved and would burn the world to ashes before he lost another. She opened her mouth to ask more, but through the front window something caught her eye. Two riders entering town from the south road. Their horses were dark against the white landscape, and they moved with the purposeful pace of men who had somewhere specific to be, too far to see faces. But something about the way they sat their saddles, the way their heads turned to scan the buildings as they passed, made Clara's blood go cold. "Sheriff," she said, her voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "Is there a back way out of town?" Brennan's expression sharpened. "You in trouble, miss?" "Yes, I cannot explain now, please." Garrett followed her gaze to the window. His eyes narrowed. Then they came back to her face, and whatever he saw there made his jaw tighten until the muscles stood out like cable. "Those men looking for you?" Clara nodded. "What did you do?" The truth came out before she could weigh it or soften it or shape it into anything less than what it was. "I witnessed a murder. The killer is my cousin. He wants me dead or married to a man who has already buried 2 wives. I answered your advertisement because I needed to disappear. I am sorry I did not tell you in my letter." "I was afraid." Silence filled the store. Through the front glass, Clara could see one of the riders dismounting near the saloon, tying his horse, looking around with the unhurried confidence of a man who had time and money and the weight of a lie dressed up as law behind him. Wyatt spoke first. "Storm will close the pass in an hour. If we leave now, we make the cabin before dark. They will not follow in a blizzard." Garrett did not take his eyes from Clara's face. He studied her the way she had seen her father study a patient. Not with suspicion, but with assessment, reading the truth of her the way a doctor reads a wound. "Get your bag," he said. "We are leaving." The ride took 3 hours, or it took 3 years. Clara could not be certain. Cole rode with her on his horse, his arms circling her waist to keep her steady in the saddle, and his body behind her blocked the worst of the wind that drove the snow sideways through the mountain passes. Garrett led on a tall gray horse riding point, his figure appearing and disappearing through the curtains of white like a ghost who knew the way. Wyatt flanked them on the right, alert, turning often to check the trail behind. Nobody spoke. There was only the crunch of hooves on snow, the labored breathing of the horses as they climbed steeper and steeper into terrain, the wind screaming through pine trees with a sound like something alive and angry. Clara's fingers went numb first, then her face, then her feet. She pressed closer to Cole's chest without thinking, and he tightened his arm around her without comment, and somewhere in that wordless exchange something small began. Not trust, not yet, but the first faint outline of it sketched in the shared warmth between two strangers in a storm. When full dark came, they were still climbing. Clara had lost all sense of direction, all sense of distance. The world had narrowed to the circle of visibility around the horse's ears and the sound of Garrett's voice calling back to his brothers at intervals steady and sure, a human compass in the howling white. Then the trees opened. A clearing appeared, and in it, illuminated by the last gray light, before true night swallowed everything, stood a cabin. It was larger than Clara expected. Built of thick logs chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney already trailing smoke into the blizzard. Outbuildings clustered nearby, a barn solid and square, a smokehouse, a storage shed, a lean-to for firewood stacked high enough to hold against a winter that clearly meant business. Garrett dismounted first, reached up and lifted Clara down from Cole's horse with hands that spanned her waist completely, and for a moment she was suspended in the air, looking down into those storm-gray eyes, and the snow fell between them like a veil being drawn. He set her on her feet and let go. "Welcome home," he said. Inside the cabin was warm. That was the first thing Clara noticed. After hours in the cold, the heat from the stone fireplace hit her like a wall, and her frozen hands began to burn, and as blood returned to her fingers. The main room was spacious and cleanly kept. A rough wooden table with 4 chairs, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, shelves lined with jars and tins, and the accumulated provisions of men who understood that winter was not a season but a siege. A door on the left stood closed. A door on the right stood open, showing a room with 3 narrow beds along the walls. And in the main room nearest the fireplace, positioned to catch every degree of warmth the stones could give, was a small bed piled high with quilts. A child lay in that bed. She was small for 6, thin in the way of children whose bodies spend more energy fighting illness than growing. Her hair was light brown, the color of late autumn fields, and it spread across the pillow like something spilled. Her face was pale. Her cheeks held the faintest hollows, shadows that should not have been there on a face so young. She was asleep or pretending to be, and Clara could hear her breathing from across the room. A faint whistle on each exhale, the sound of lungs that had been damaged and had healed imperfectly, scarred on the inside where no one could see. Bess. The child did not stir as the adults entered, did not open her eyes when Garrett knelt beside her bed and touched her forehead with fingers still raw from the cold. But something in her face changed, a tightening. The involuntary flinch of a child who had learned that people who came through doors sometimes did not come back. Garrett looked at Clara, and in that look there was nothing of the granite, nothing of the control, nothing of the careful distance he maintained like armor against the world. There was only a father, and the silent, desperate request that every parent makes when they have reached the limit of what their own hands can do. "Help her." "That room on the left is yours," Garrett said, straightening. His voice had returned to its normal register. Controlled, steady, giving nothing away. "We built it after I sent the advertisement. Privacy for you, we sleep across the hall." Clara nodded. She looked around the room once more. At the fireplace throwing shadows on the log walls. At the 3 beds visible through the open door where the brothers would sleep close as they had always been. At the child in the small bed by the fire breathing her imperfect breaths. She set her carpet bag down. She removed her coat. She rolled up her sleeves. "I will need hot water," she said. "Clean cloth, whatever dried herbs you have in the kitchen, and I will need someone to hold a lantern while I listen to her chest." Cole moved first. Wyatt followed. Within minutes, the cabin was alive with quiet activity. Water heating on the stove cloth being torn into strips. Jars of dried thyme and elderflower and peppermint being set on the table. Clara opened her father's medical kit and arranged the instruments with the practiced hands of a woman who had been preparing for this moment her entire life without knowing it. She sat beside the child's bed, placed her hand gently on the small chest, felt the rise and fall, felt the slight rattle, the vibration of air moving through passages that were not fully clear. Bess opened her eyes. They were gray. Her father's eyes, serious and deep and far too old for 6 years. They looked at Clara without welcome, without curiosity, without warmth. They looked at her the way a child looks at a stranger who has come to sit in the chair where her mother used to sit. Then Bess turned her face to the wall. Clara did not flinch, did not try to coax or cajole or win the child over with smiles and gentle words. She simply began to work. She mixed a tincture from thyme and elderflower with warm water and a spoonful of honey from a jar on the shelf. She set the cup beside the bed. She laid a warm, damp cloth across the child's narrow chest, and she waited. Garrett stood in the doorway watching. Cole leaned against the table. Wyatt had gone still by the stove, his amber eyes following Clara's hands with the focused attention of a man cataloging evidence. Three brothers, three sets of eyes, all watching the stranger who had arrived in their home like a storm-blown bird, carrying secrets and blood, stained memories, and a carpet bag full of instruments their mother would not have recognized. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire crackled, and the child breathed, and Clara Whitfield began the work she had come 2,000 miles to do. She did not know, sitting there in the lamplight with a sick child and three silent men, and the howl of a Montana winter closing the passes behind her, that the men who hunted her were already asking questions in Boulder Creek. That Herbert Marsh himself was on a train heading west, with documents that bore her name and a story crafted with the precision of a man who understood that the law was a weapon more effective than any blade. That in 30 days, everything she had built in these first fragile hours would be tested by forces she could not yet see. She did not know that the child who had turned away from her would become the reason she stayed. That the man who stood in the doorway with grief carved into the lines of his face would become the man she chose. That the brothers who watched her now with guarded eyes would become the family she had lost and found again in a form she never expected. She did not know any of that, not yet. All she knew was the weight of the cup in her hand, the sound of a child's breath, the warmth of a fire in a cabin on a mountain where no one could reach her, and the feeling small but certain, like the first green shoot pushing through frozen ground, that she had not come to the end of her road. She had come to the beginning of it. Winter came to the Montana Territory the way grief comes to those who think they have already felt the worst of it. Slowly at first, then all at once. The first week in the cabin passed in a rhythm that Clara learned the way a body learns to breathe in thinner air. Not easily, not naturally, but because the alternative was to stop breathing entirely, and Clara Whitfield had not crossed 2,000 miles to suffocate in silence. She rose before dawn each morning, fed the stove with split pine until the fire crackled, hot enough to warm the water bucket, and mixed the tincture she had devised for Bess. Thyme for the lungs, elderflower for the fever that crept in at odd hours, honey to make the taste bearable for a child who had no interest in swallowing anything a stranger offered. She set the cup beside the small bed. She did not hover, did not coax, did not smile with the desperate brightness of a woman trying too hard to be loved. She simply placed the cup and walked away. Bess did not drink it, not the first morning, not the second. On the third morning, Clara found the cup empty and the child watching her from beneath the quilts with those gray eyes that gave nothing and took everything in. Clara said nothing. She refilled the cup and set it back in its place and went to help Wyatt with breakfast. On the fourth morning, Bess drank the tincture while Clara watched. On the fifth, the child coughed less. On the sixth, she asked for more honey. These were not victories announced with trumpets. They were the small, quiet shifts that happen between two people when one refuses to push and the other begins slowly, cautiously to stop pulling away. Clara knew better than to rush it. She had watched her father sit with patients who were afraid, watched him wait, watched the stillness of his hands and the patience of his eyes, and the way he let silence do the work that words could not. "Your father taught you well," she could almost hear him say. "Patience is the first instrument in the kit." The brothers moved around her in patterns she was beginning to read. Garrett rose earliest before even Clara and was out of the cabin before light touched the peaks. He returned at dusk with feed for the horses or game for the table, or nothing at all. His coat crusted with ice and his face closed like a door with no handle on the outside. He never spoke more than was necessary, never raised his voice, never once acted as though Clara owed him anything for saving her from the men in Boulder Creek. Wyatt was the center. The kitchen was his domain, and he commanded it with the quiet authority of a man who understood that feeding people was its own form of love. He taught Clara to make bread on the fourth day, standing beside her at the counter, showing her the motion of kneading with hands that were surprisingly gentle for their size. His instructions were patient and precise, and he kept a respectful distance that somehow made her more aware of his presence, not less. She caught herself listening for the low hum he made while cooking a tuneless murmur that was not music but was not nothing either. Cole was the warmth. He moved among the horses in the barn with a tenderness that seemed impossible for a man built from stone and sinew, murmuring to the animals in a voice that made them lean into his touch like children seeking comfort. He was the first to laugh and the last to take offense, and when he looked at Clara, his green eyes held a curiosity that was frank without being intrusive. But it was Bess who held Clara's attention. The child who would not speak to her, the child who turned her face to the wall, the child whose small, damaged lungs whistled in the night like a kettle that could never quite reach boiling. On the seventh night, Clara could not sleep. She lay in the small room that had been Rose's on the bed where Rose had slept beneath a quilt that still smelled faintly of lavender and loss. She stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind test the cabin walls for weakness it would never find. Then she heard it, a cough, not the dry, shallow cough of dust or cold. About the afternoons in his surgery, when he would let her hold the instruments while he worked her small hands trembling, his large hands steady. About the night she delivered her first baby at 17, and how the mother screamed and Clara nearly fainted, and the baby came out blue and silent, and Clara thought she had killed it until her father turned it over and slapped its back, and the scream that came from that tiny mouth was the most beautiful sound Clara had ever heard. She told about making mistakes, about the time she mixed a poultice wrong and it burned a patient's skin, and her father did not shout at her, but simply said, "Now you will never mix it wrong again." About learning that failure was not the end of competence, but the beginning of it. She told these things to the ceiling and the fire and the dark, and Bess lay still in the bed beside her, not sleeping, not turning away, just listening with the fierce concentration of a child who is hungry for a voice that is not trying to sell her anything. Not comfort, not reassurance, just truth offered freely with no expectation of return. When Clara finally fell silent, she heard a sound so small it might have been the fire settling. But it was not the fire. It was a hand, a small hand reaching out from beneath the quilt and resting lightly on Clara's shoulder. Resting there the way a bird lands on a branch it is not yet certain will hold. Clara did not move, did not turn, did not acknowledge the touch except by staying exactly where she was, breathing steadily, letting the child decide how long the moment lasted. Bess's hand stayed, and something in the cabin shifted. Not the walls, not the floor. Something older and less visible. Something that had been broken for 3 years and was beginning slowly to remember the shape it once held. The next morning, Bess drank her tincture without being asked. On the 10th day, a rider came. Clara was hanging laundry on a line Wyatt had strung between 2 pines behind the cabin. The cold turned the wet cloth stiff within minutes, and her fingers ached from wringing water that wanted to become ice. She heard the horse before she saw it, the crunch of hooves on packed snow coming up the trail from the south. The man who rode into the clearing was not young and not old. 45 perhaps, with a face that had been tanned by sun and scoured by wind into something resembling cured leather. His eyes were narrow not from cruelty, but from years of squinting at horizons that offered no shade. He wore a sheepskin coat and a hat that had survived more weather than most buildings, and he swung down from his saddle with the stiff efficiency of a man whose body had long since stopped expecting comfort from the act of dismounting. Clem Hargrove. He had worked for Garrett during the busy seasons for 4 years. He did not knock on the cabin door. He walked in like a man entering his own barn, stamped the snow from his boots, looked around the room, saw Clara's borrowed dress hanging from a hook and Bess's medicine cup on the table, and the small signs of a woman's presence in a place that had known none for 3 years, and turned to Garrett with an expression that mixed disbelief with something close to alarm. "You brought home extra mouths to feed in the middle of winter coming on," Clem said. He did not lower his voice, did not seem to think he needed to. He spoke with the blunt certainty of a man who had earned the right to say what he thought by surviving enough years in the same hard country. "What are you thinking?" Garrett said nothing. He looked at Clem the way a mountain looks at a cloud. Patient, unmoved, willing to wait until the noise passed. Clara felt the judgment settle over her like a coat she had not asked to wear. She had felt it before. In Boston after her father died. In every room where men decided what a woman alone was worth. The look that said, "What kind of creature ends up like this?" She went back to hanging laundry. She did not explain herself. She did not need to. The laundry needed hanging, and the cold was real, and the work would speak for her or nothing would. That afternoon, while Clara checked Bess's temperature by pressing her wrist to the child's forehead, Clem walked past the cabin window. He stopped, not looking at Clara directly, but speaking loud enough to be heard through the glass. "You know how he lost his wife," Clem said. It was not a question. It was a stone thrown into still water. Ask him about the medicine ride. Ask him what happens when a man leaves his sick wife and baby girl alone for 3 days. Then he walked on, and Clara was left with the wind snapping the frozen laundry and a new weight settling in her chest beside all the others she already carried. She did not ask, not that day. She had learned from her father that some diagnoses require patience, that pulling at a wound before it is ready only tears the tissue further. Instead, she proved herself the way she knew best. Through work. The storm came without warning on the 12th night. Not the season's worst, not yet, but a hard wind that screamed through the valley and shook the cabin walls and tore a section of the east fence clean away. Garrett and Clem had ridden out that morning to check the herd at the far pasture and had not returned by dark. Clara heard the cattle first, restless, lowing, the sound of animals sensing freedom through a gap they were not supposed to find. Then the creak of broken fence posts and the heavy thud of hooves on soft ground. The cows were getting out. She looked at Bess asleep by the fire. She looked at Wyatt, who had gone to the barn to secure the horses. She pulled on Garrett's spare coat, grabbed the hammer and the coil of wire from the lean-to, and walked out into the dark. It took her 2 hours. The wire cut her palms through the work gloves until blood soaked the leather. The wind knocked her flat twice, once hard enough to drive the breath from her body and leave her gasping in the mud. She worked by lantern light, driving stakes with numb fingers, twisting wire around posts she could barely see. Her shoulders burned, her back screamed. The cold found every gap in the coat and settled there like it owned the space. Halfway through, a light appeared behind her. Bess, the child, had woken, found Clara gone, put on her coat and boots, and carried the second lantern out into the storm without being asked. She did not speak. She stood in the wind with her small jaw set and her gray eyes steady and held the light while Clara worked. 6 years old, lungs that whistled when she breathed, standing in a blizzard holding a lantern for a woman who was not her mother, because that was what you did when you were Bess Holden. You held the light. By dawn, the fence held. Not pretty, not perfect, but enough. Garrett and Clem rode in with the sun both mud-crusted and grim from a night chasing strays through timber. Garrett saw the fence first, then Clara's hands raw and bloody, then Bess asleep on the porch step with her head on Clara's lap, the lantern still burning beside her. He did not say thank you, did not say well done. He stood before the mended fence and looked at it and then at Clara and gave one nod, slow and deep, the nod of a man revising something he thought he understood about the world. Clem stood behind him, the skeptic, the man who had asked, "What are you thinking?" He stared at the fence, then at Clara's bleeding hands, then at the child curled in her lap. "You know wire work?" Clem asked. His voice had none of its usual edge. "I grew up on a farm," Clara said. Clem said nothing more, but that evening he ate 2 bowls of the stew she made and did not complain about a single thing. And when he looked at Clara across the table, the squint had changed. Not warm yet, but the doubt had cracked, and through the crack, something like respect was beginning to show. The days lengthened. Clara swept the floor with a broom made of bundled straw. She patched the torn curtain with thread pulled from her own hem. She learned which draft to seal at midnight and which to crack at dawn. She learned the sound the chimney made when the wind shifted north, a moan like something grieving, and how to adjust the flue before the smoke backed up and filled the room. And every evening, by the light of the single oil lamp, the brothers filled in the private details of their lives, and Clara offered pieces of hers in return. The brothers had told her the broad strokes in Boulder Creek, but now in the long evenings by the fire the details came. Wyatt spoke about the first winter after their parents died, how Garrett worked 14-hour days at a lumber camp and came home with his hands bleeding and never said a word about it. How Cole, barely 14, taught himself to trap rabbits so they would have meat. How the 3 of them shared one blanket that first December because Garrett had sold the other 2 to buy seed for spring. Cole told about the day Garrett found this land, rode up the trail alone, came back 3 days later, and said only 2 words: "Found it." And they had followed him up the mountain without asking a single question, because following Garrett had kept them alive this long, and doubt was a luxury none of them could afford. Clara told about her father in return. Not the broad facts she had shared in the store, but the private ones. The way he hummed off-key while stitching wounds. The afternoon he cried in his surgery after losing a child to scarlet fever, and Clara had stood outside the door, listening, understanding for the first time that strength and sorrow could live in the same body. She did not tell about Herbert. Not yet. That door was still locked, and the key was not ready to be turned. But on the eighth night, Clara found the hinge of a different door. She was straightening the bedding in her room when her hand brushed something beneath the cot. She knelt and reached under. Her fingers closed around a tin box, half open, pushed deep beneath the frame, as though someone had wanted it hidden, but could not bear to put it out of reach. Inside were three things. A photograph creased at the corners of a woman holding a child. The woman was thin and fair-haired, with a smile that looked like it came easily. The child in her arms was laughing. On the back in pencil that had faded nearly to nothing, Rose and Bess. June 1875. My girls. The handwriting was Garrett's. A small brown glass bottle empty, with a label too faded to read. Medicine that had arrived too late, and a letter on yellowed paper written in a doctor's careful hand. She unfolded it. Dear Mr. Holden, I write this knowing it will bring you no comfort, but hoping it may in time bring you peace. I did everything in my medical power. The disease had progressed beyond what any treatment could reverse. Had you been present, the outcome would have been the same. Please do not carry this burden any longer than you must. The letter stopped mid-thought. The paper continued to where a second page should have been, but that page was gone, torn away. The edge was clean straight, deliberate, as though someone had placed a ruler along the fold and pulled. Clara stared at the torn edge, at the words that stopped where truth should have continued, at the space where something had been and now was not. She placed everything back exactly as she had found it. She said nothing about it, but the question lodged itself behind her ribs like a splinter too deep to pull. Who had torn that page and what had it said? A week later, on a night when the wind was quiet and the fire burned low, and the cabin held the kind of stillness that makes hidden things easier to find, Clara checked the box again, not searching, just needing to hold the photograph one more time to look at the face of the woman whose bed she slept in and whose child she was learning to love. Her fingers found something she had missed before. A scrap of paper smaller than the others, folded into a tight square and pressed into the very bottom corner of the tin. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was different from the doctor's letter. Lighter, feminine. The ink had faded nearly to nothing, and the paper was soft from being handled many times, folded and folded again by hands that needed to touch the words, the way some people need to touch a wound to believe it is healing. Josiah, do not lock yourself away. Find a reason to go on. I forgave you long before you left. Do not make me watch you die slowly from where I am. Live. Rose. Clara held the letter. She knew that Josiah was Garrett's middle name. She had seen it on the homestead advertisement. Garrett Josiah Holden. Rose had called him by his middle name, the private name, the one that belonged to the space between husband and wife, where no one else was invited. This was a dying woman's last gift to the man she loved. A permission, a release, a door left open from the other side. Clara cried, not for herself, for Garrett, for Rose, for the baby girl named Bess who had laughed in a photograph and grown into a child who held lanterns in storms. For all the people who leave and all the people who stay, and the distance between them, that love tries to cross and sometimes manages to bridge. She placed the letter back, folded it exactly as it had been, pressed it into the corner of the tin, and closed the lid. She did not speak of it to Garrett, not yet, but she carried the knowledge of it the way she carried her father's journal, close, hidden, waiting for the moment when it would be needed most. The first trip to Boulder Creek came on a day when the sky was so blue, it looked painted, and the cold had retreated just enough to make the trail passable. Clara needed medicines for Bess, dried willow bark for fever, camphor for the chest, supplies her tinctures could not replace. Garrett drove the wagon. Clara sat beside him. Neither spoke for the first hour. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had run out of small talk before they ever began and were learning to exist in the spaces between words. Boulder Creek looked smaller in daylight than it had in the storm. Meaner. A town that had been built on ambition and was surviving on stubbornness. Garrett stopped the wagon in front of the general store and helped Clara down. His hand stayed on her elbow a moment longer than it needed to. "I will be at the feedlot," he said. "Stay clear of the saloon." She did not intend to go near it. The store smelled of coffee and kerosene and dried apples. Dorothea Hensley stood behind the counter, a solid woman with gray-streaked hair pulled tight and the kind of face that had stopped trying to be pretty 3 decades ago and settled instead for honest. She watched Clara enter with eyes that cataloged everything and revealed only what she chose. "You are the one staying with the Holden brothers," Dorothea said. It was not a question. Clara set her list on the counter. "I am caring for Garrett's daughter. Her lungs need tending." Dorothea studied her for a long moment, then began pulling items from the shelves. The door opened. A gust of cold air brought in a woman who appeared to have been constructed from starch and moral certainty. Edna Pruitt was 50 years old, slim as a fence rail, dressed in a blue wool dress with a cameo at the throat. She carried herself with the absolute confidence of a woman who had decided long ago that her opinion and the Lord's were interchangeable. She stopped when she saw Clara. Her eyes traveled from Clara's worn boots to her calloused hands, to her face sunburned and peeling, to the frayed collar of her borrowed dress. She smiled the way a cat smiles at a bird it has already caught. "So, you are the mail-order bride, the one living with 3 unmarried men, no wedding yet, no ring, tending another woman's child." She turned to her companion with an expression of practiced sorrow. Heavens. Clara met her eyes without flinching. "I am a medical attendant for a sick little girl, Mrs. Pruitt. I am there because the child needs me. My husband is the judge of this county. Dear." Edna let the word dear carry the weight of a gavel. "Propriety is exactly what we are discussing." Dorothea Hensley stepped between them with the precision of a woman placing herself between a match and a powder keg. "Mrs. Pruitt, your order is ready in the back. Would you like to inspect it?" Edna held Clara's gaze for one more heartbeat, a heartbeat that said, "I know what you are, and I know what becomes of women like you in my town." Then she turned with a swash of wool and followed Dorothea through the curtain. Clara stood alone. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the counter until they stopped. Dorothea returned alone. She leaned close, voice low and fast. "Listen to me carefully. There is a man who arrived in town last week, a lawyer, from back east, name of Herbert Marsh." The floor tilted beneath Clara's feet. "He has been meeting with Edna Pruitt," Dorothea continued, "twice, in the saloon office. He is telling everyone you are dangerous, a fugitive. He has papers, Clara, official-looking papers, and Edna is carrying his words through every parlor and pewus in this town like she was born to do it." Clara took the bag of supplies from the counter. Her face felt like it belonged to someone else. Dorothea slipped something extra inside, a small sack of sugar and a packet of dried apple slices. "For the child," she said. "And Clara," she squeezed her hand once hard, "you are not alone here, even when it feels that way." The ride home was silent. Garrett saw her face when she climbed onto the wagon seat and asked one question. "What happened?" She told him. About Edna, about the whispers, about the church women and the judgment that was already spreading through Boulder Creek like frost on a window. He listened without interrupting his jaw, working slowly the way it did when he was holding something back that wanted to come out as action instead of words. "You do not need their approval," he said when she finished. "No, but I need them not to be a weapon pointed at us." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw him understand the shape of her fear in a way that went beyond what language could carve. They found the cabin undisturbed when they returned, but on the table weighted beneath a river stone was a piece of paper, a wanted notice, printed on rough stock, the ink still dark. Wanted Clara Whitfield, age 22, fair hair, blue eyes, sought for questioning in the murder of Silas Green. Boston, Massachusetts. Reward $500. Beneath the notice in handwriting, she recognized, because she had read it on documents in her father's study for years, a note. "I know where you are. 30 days. Return to Boston or I come for you." Herbert. Clara read it twice, folded it, put it in her pocket. Evidence was evidence. Garrett watched her from across the room. His voice was quiet, but it filled the cabin the way stone fills a wall. Is this the truth? Clara looked at him, into the gray eyes that had seen his wife die and his daughter nearly follow, and had somehow kept looking at the world when most men would have closed their eyes for good. I did not kill anyone. My cousin Herbert Marsh stabbed Silas Green with a letter opener in his own office. I was standing in the doorway. His blood hit my dress before I knew what was happening. Herbert told me to marry his associate or he would blame me for the murder. I ran. That is the entire truth. The fire crackled. Bess slept in her small bed. Cole stood motionless near the door. Wyatt leaned against the stove with his arms crossed and his amber eyes unreadable. Garrett was silent for a long time. Then he said two words that carried more weight than all the documents Herbert Marsh could forge. I believe you. That night, Clara could not sleep. She sat at the table after the others had gone to their rooms and Bess had settled into the rhythmic breathing that meant true rest. The oil lamp threw a circle of gold around her hands. She opened her father's medical kit, the journal. She had nearly forgotten it in the chaos of arrival and the slow-consuming work of earning a place in this household. But now she opened it again and read slowly, carefully every entry. Her father had documented 2 years of Herbert's theft, sums diverted from the family practice, property payments redirected, insurance funds claimed for services never rendered. Every entry dated, annotated, cross-referenced with bank records that her father had somehow obtained. It was methodical, devastating. The work of a man who understood that evidence was a kind of medicine too. The right dose applied to the right wound could bring even the most powerful sickness to its knees. She closed the journal, held it against her chest, and thought about the tin box under the bed, the torn letter, the missing second page. Doc Whitaker had written to Garrett after Rose died, telling him the disease had moved too fast that no medicine could have saved her. But someone had come into this cabin and torn away the second page. Someone who collected secrets the way other men collected debts. Someone who understood that information was currency and silence was power. The next evening, she sat with Garrett on the porch step. The stars were hard and bright above them. The snow reflected their light, and the whole clearing shimmered like something dreamed. Clara spoke carefully. The letter from Doc Whitaker, the one in the tin box under the bed. Someone tore out the second page. Garrett went very still. The kind of stillness that is not calm, but the absence of motion that precedes an earthquake. When I came back from burying Rose, he said the box had been opened. The second page was gone. I thought I had imagined it. Thought the grief was making me see things that were not there. Clara shook her head. You did not imagine it. Herbert Marsh is a man who collects leverage, letters, debts, secrets. That is how he controls people. If he was in this territory before, if he has had dealings here, he could have taken that page to use against you later. Garrett turned to look at her. In the starlight, his face was stripped of every defense. He looked like a man seeing a wound he had carried for years, suddenly identified and named. He has something on the deputy, Garrett said slowly. Buckley changed after Marsh arrived. Started avoiding me in town. Started looking at the ground when I spoke. Clara felt the pieces shifting like tumblers in a lock. Herbert was not just pursuing her. He was building infrastructure, a network of fear and obligation that would let him control Boulder Creek the way he had controlled Boston. Deputy Buckley in his pocket. Edna Pruitt as his voice in the community. The wanted poster as his weapon against Clara. And somewhere in whatever was written on that torn second page, a weapon against Garrett. She stood. I am going to fight, she said, him and everything he has built here. Garrett looked up at her, starlight in his eyes. You need legal standing, he said. A married woman with a household has rights that an unmarried woman living on someone else's land does not. A wife can testify, can own property, can stand before a judge and be heard. Clara heard what he was saying. She heard what he was not saying. If we married before Herbert files his case, she said, he cannot easily remove a woman with a husband, a home, and a community willing to speak for her. Is that the reason Garrett stood? He met her eyes. His hands were at his sides, and his face was open in a way she had not seen before, stripped of the careful reserve he wore like armor. No, he said, it is not the reason. But it is the truth the law would see. She stepped closer. I do not want to marry out of fear. Then do not. Marry because you want to. The snow began falling again. Soft. Straight down. No wind. It gathered on his shoulders and caught in her hair and melted on her eyelashes. The distance between them was the width of a fist. She could feel the heat of him through the cold air. I want to, she said. He reached out and brushed a snowflake from her cheek with a gentleness that was almost unbearable from a man his size. His fingers lingered for a moment against her skin, rough and warm, and Clara felt something shift inside her chest that had been frozen for a very long time. They did not kiss. The moment was too full for anything more. They stood in the snow and looked at each other, and what passed between them was not a contract or an arrangement, but a choice made freely by two people who had both learned the difference between need and chose want anyway. But the storm that came 2 days later did not care about choices. It arrived without warning on a night so dark and so cold that the trees in the forest cracked like gunshots. Snow fell sideways, driven by a wind that found every gap in the cabin walls. The temperature dropped so fast that the water bucket beside the stove froze solid in an hour. Clara woke to the sound she had been dreading since the first night she listened to Bess breathe. Not the dry cough, not the wheeze. This was deeper, wetter, a sound that came from a place inside the child's chest where no sound should live. Clara pulled Bess into the lamplight and her heart stopped. The girl's skin was gray, her forehead burned. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, each one ending with a sound like cloth being torn slowly apart. Pneumonia. Clara knew it the way her father had taught her to know. Not from textbooks, but from the place inside a healer that connects to the patient through something older than language. She needed medicine she did not have. She needed a doctor. The nearest one was Doc Whitaker in Boulder Creek, 3 hours by horse in clear weather. In this storm, perhaps 6, perhaps forever. Garrett came through the door from the barn, drawn by instinct, snow crusted on his coat and his face. He looked at Bess and the color left him. Every bit of it. His skin went white, then gray, and his eyes fixed on his daughter's face with an expression that was not just fear, but memory. He was seeing Rose. He was seeing the house that had gone quiet 3 years ago, while he was 3 days away with medicine that arrived too late. Not again. The words were barely audible. A prayer or a curse or both. Not again. He reached for his coat, pulled his hat down hard, moved toward the door. Clara caught his arm. Her fingers closed on the rough wool. You will die out there. Garrett looked at Bess, then at Clara. His eyes were absolutely clear. The eyes of a man who had looked into his own darkest place and decided he would not return to it. I was late once, he said. I will not be late again. The door opened, the storm swallowed him, and then there was nothing but the wind and the child and the terrible sound of Bess fighting for every breath. Clara did not wait. She did not sit beside the bed and pray or wring her hands or stare at the door willing it to open. She worked. She boiled water and tore strips of cloth and heated them on the stove until they steamed. She laid them across Bess's narrow chest, replaced them when they cooled, replaced them again. She propped the child upright against a mound of quilts and pillows, so gravity could help the lungs do what they could no longer do alone. She mixed every herb in the kitchen: thyme, elderflower, peppermint, willow bark steeped in hot water to bring the fever down. She spooned the liquid into Bess's mouth with the steady hands of a woman who had been trained to hold instruments inside living bodies without trembling. And she talked to the child. Not medical instructions, not reassurances. She told stories. The same kind she had told on the 7th night sitting on the floor with her back against the wall. Stories about her father. About a kitchen in Boston where her mother had sung songs Clara did not remember learning, but could never forget. About a woman named Lenora who had given a stranger $40 in a newspaper and said, "Go disappear, survive." Wyatt sat beside her through the hours, red-eyed silent, keeping the water hot and the cloths ready. Cole knelt in the corner with his hands pressed together and his lips moving in a prayer that was not from any book, but from the desperate improvisation of a man asking God for something he did not have the words to properly request. Bess held Clara's hand, not the way she had touched Clara's shoulder that first night, tentatively ready to withdraw. She held it the way a child holds a rope in deep water, with everything she had. The hours crawled, the stove crackled, the wind howled, and Clara held Bess and breathed with her, matching each ragged inhale with one of her own, as if she could teach the child's lungs to work by example. Dawn came gray and bitter, and with it the sound. Hooves. Faint at first, then louder. The creak of frozen leather. A voice. The door burst open and Garrett fell through it. Not walked. Fell. His face was blue-white. His lips cracked and bleeding. His hands were frozen into claws around reins he could no longer feel. Ice hung from his eyebrows and the stubble of his beard. He had been in the saddle for 6 hours in a blizzard that would have killed most men in 4. Behind him, leaning on his arm, came Doc Whitaker, 60 years old, thin as a fence post, shaking so hard his medical bag rattled, but alive. And here, Doc went to Bess immediately, hands trembling, eyes sharp as scalpels. He listened to the child's chest with his ear pressed flat against her back. He mixed tinctures from bottles in his bag with a steadiness that defied the violent shaking of his fingers. He packed warm cloths around her chest and elevated her head and told Clara to keep the stove burning as hot as she could stand. 1 hour passed, 2. The room held its breath. Then Bess's breathing changed. The rattle softened, the wheeze thinned. Her color shifted from gray to white to the faintest suggestion of pink, like dawn touching a winter sky. Her eyes opened, found Clara's face, and she let out a cry that was not pain, but hunger. Clara wept, because hunger meant alive, and alive was all she had ever asked for. She crossed the room to where Garrett had collapsed against the wall. His coat was still on. Ice melted down his face in streams. His hands lay useless in his lap, frozen beyond feeling. She knelt before him and took those hands and pressed them against her chest, trying to give back the warmth he had spent. She leaned forward, pressed her forehead to his, and cried. Not quietly, not delicately. She cried the way a woman cries when the worst thing she could imagine came to the door and was turned away by a man who rode 6 hours through a killing storm because he had once arrived too late and swore on everything he was that he never would again. Garrett was still for a long moment. Then his arms came up around her, slow and stiff and shaking, and he held her. His body trembled against hers. She did not know if it was the cold or something else. She did not ask, and from the bed a small hand reached out. Bess's hand. Clara took it. Garrett took it. 3 hands, 3 people. And in that moment, in a cabin shuddering against the last gasps of a storm that had tried its best to break them, a family was born. Not from blood or paper or the law, from the choice to hold on. They stayed that way until the shaking stopped. Doc Whitaker pulled Clara aside near the stove. His voice was low. The girl will live. Keep her warm. Keep her fed. The cough will linger for a week, but the worst has passed. His eyes sharp as they were held something more than medical assessment. You saved her, Mrs. Whitfield. The herbs you used, the heat treatments, the way you kept her breathing through the night. I could not have done better myself. Clara nodded, unable to speak. Doc hesitated, then leaned closer. There is something else you should know. Herbert Marsh has been to see Judge Pruitt. He has filed for a warrant, an extradition order to bring you back to Boston for the murder of Silas Green. And he has Wade Buckley in his pocket. The deputy is doing everything Marsh tells him. He paused. The hearing is set. 10 days from now. The words landed like stones. Clara stood very still. The stove crackled beside her. Bess slept in her bed, breathing easily now, alive and warm, and unaware that the world was still trying to take things from the people who loved her. Outside, the blizzard was dying and the sky was turning the color of ash and forgiveness. She looked at Garrett, asleep against the wall with melted ice pooling beneath him. She looked at Bess. She looked at her own hands, raw and cracked, incapable. Then she set her jaw and went to the table and lit the lamp and took out paper and the stub of a pencil. She began to write. She wrote everything, the sequence of events in Herbert's office, every detail she could remember, the smell of brandy, the sound the letter opener made when Herbert pulled it free, the exact words of his threat. She wrote about Marcus Blackwell and his 2 dead wives. She wrote about the wanted poster left on the cabin table. She wrote about Edna Pruitt and the whispers spreading through Boulder Creek like poison poured into a well. And she opened her father's journal and placed it beside her notes, and for the first time she understood what it truly was. Not just evidence of theft, a weapon. The weapon her father had forged in secret, knowing he might not live to wield it himself, trusting that somehow someday it would find its way into the hands of someone who could. She organized everything, numbered the pages, cross-referenced dates, built her case the way she had built the herb treatments for Bess, one ingredient at a time, measured precisely, combined with care, designed to heal what was broken and cut out what was diseased. She did not have a lawyer. She did not have money. She did not have the judge's wife on her side, or the deputy's badge, or the weight of a man's name on a property deed. She had the truth, her father's journal, and herself. Dawn was breaking when she set the pencil down. Her hand ached, her eyes burned, but the stack of papers on the table was thick and organized and devastating in its clarity. She looked toward the door. Garrett had been moved to the brothers' room by Wyatt and Cole during the night. Doc Whitaker slept in a chair by the stove, his medical bag clutched to his chest like a child holds a toy. Bess breathed softly in her bed. The storm was over. The world outside was white and still. 10 days, one hearing, Herbert Marsh on one side, Clara Whitfield on the other. And between them a judge, a town full of people who had already been told what to believe, and a stack of papers tied with kitchen string that contained either her salvation or her ruin. Clara stood, stretched her back, fed the stove. She was ready. But the next morning, Garrett was gone. The horse was gone. The saddle was gone. His heavy coat was gone. Only the thin smell of hay and the warmth of where the horse had stood remained in the barn. And on the table, held down by the same river stone that had weighted Herbert's note, a piece of paper in Garrett's rough, slanting hand. "There is something I must do before I can stand beside you at that hearing. I will be back, trust me." Clara read it twice, 3 times. She held the paper in both hands and felt the tremor that came whenever someone she depended on walked through a door without saying when they would return. Every man she had trusted had left. Her father left in a sickbed and never came out. Herbert left in a letter full of lies. The man she had traveled 2,000 miles to marry had not existed at all until she arrived and found something real in his place. Something built on grief and hard labor, and a child's damaged lungs. And now Garrett. She sat at the table for a long time. Bess found her there when the sun came up. The girl stood in the doorway of the main room barefoot, her nightgown too short at the wrists, her hair tangled from sleep. She looked at her father's empty barn, through the window and then at Clara's face, and she understood everything without being told, the way children always understand before adults think they can. "Is he coming back?" Bess asked. Clara folded the note, put it in her pocket with the others. The wanted poster, Herbert's threat, Garrett's promise. A pocket full of paper that was either worthless or priceless, depending on which words turned out to be true. "Yes," she said, because she needed it to be true, and because the child standing in front of her needed it more. 2 days passed. Clara fed Bess, mixed medicines, kept the stove burning, checked the cattle with Wyatt and Cole. She did the work of 2 people with the body of one and the heart of a woman standing at the edge of the last cliff she could find, looking down and choosing not to jump. Every night she sat at the table and worked on her case, adding details, refining arguments, preparing for a hearing where she would stand alone, without a lawyer, without money, without anything except the evidence her dead father had left her and the words she would find when she opened her mouth and spoke the truth to a room full of strangers who had already been taught to doubt her. On the second night, Bess came to the table. She stood beside Clara and looked at the papers spread across the surface. She did not ask what they were. She reached up and placed her small hand over Clara's hand, the one holding the pencil, and held it there. "Mama used to write letters at this table," Bess said. Her voice was quiet but steady. The voice of a child who had carried too much and learned too early that carrying was simply what you did when there was no one else. Clara's throat closed. It was the first time Bess had mentioned Rose. The first time the child had offered a piece of her mother's memory to the woman who slept in her mother's room. "She was brave," Clara said. "Your mother." Braver than she knew. Bess looked at her with those gray eyes. "You are brave too." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to say that bravery was for people who had choices and she was simply a woman with none. But looking at the child's face, at the bones too sharp and the eyes too old, and the courage that burned in them like a lamp that refused to go out, she understood something she had not understood before. Bravery was not the absence of fear. It was the act of continuing, of sitting at a table with a pencil and a stack of paper and building something from nothing, because the alternative was to let the darkness win. Her father had done it, Rose had done it, and now Clara was doing it. "You carried us here," Bess said. She did not say Mama. She did not say Clara. She said something in between, something that had no name yet, but would grow into one. "You will keep us here." Clara looked at her daughter, because that was what Bess had become. Not by blood, not by law, by the slow, stubborn accumulation of nights spent sitting on a cold floor telling stories, mornings spent mixing medicine, hands held through fever and fear, by the choice made again and again to stay. "Yes," she said, "I will." She picked up the pencil and kept writing. 3 days until the hearing, Garrett gone, Herbert circling, the judge's wife poisoning the well, a deputy in the pocket of a murderer, and Clara Whitfield alone at a table in a cabin on a mountain with a 6-year-old girl and a stack of paper, and the unshakable conviction that the truth spoken clearly and without flinching could still defeat the money and the lies and the law arrayed against her. She had walked 2,000 miles. She had mixed medicine in the dark. She had held a child through a night that nearly took her. She had done all of it without anyone telling her she could. She could do this too. Outside, the wind had died. The sky was clearing, and somewhere on a trail that Clara could not see, a man on horseback was riding hard towards something he needed to bring back before it was too late. The morning of the third day began with the sound of hooves on frozen ground. Clara was at the stove heating water for Bess. She set the pot down, dried her hands, walked to the door, and opened it. Garrett Holden came up the trail on foot, leading the horse. He looked like a man who had not slept in 2 days, which was the truth, though truth and appearance had not always kept each other's company in Clara's experience. His eyes were red-rimmed. His beard had grown past stubble into something that belonged on a man 10 years older. His coat was crusted with trail dust and dried sweat and the particular grime that comes from riding hard through country that does not want to be crossed. But his back was straight. His step was sure. And when he saw Clara standing in the doorway with the morning light behind her, something moved across his face that was not a smile, but the ground on which a smile might someday be built. Behind him walked a second figure, shorter, thinner, bundled against the cold in a coat 2 sizes too large. Doc Whitaker. The old man carried his medical bag in one hand and a leather satchel in the other, and he moved with the stiff determination of a person who has made a decision that frightens him and intends to see it through before his courage runs out. And behind Doc, sitting on a mule that looked as tired and stubborn as its rider, was a woman Clara had not expected to see again on this side of the grave. Lenora Price, 60 years old, broad-shouldered, wrapped in so many layers she looked twice her size. Her face was red from cold and white from exhaustion, and set with the particular resolve of a woman who had crossed half a continent because someone she loved needed her, and distance was not a good enough reason to stay behind. Clara's hand found the door frame. She gripped it. Garrett stopped at the foot of the porch steps. "I am sorry I left without telling you why," he said. Clara came down the steps. She stood in front of him with her arms crossed, not in anger, but in the way of a woman holding herself together until she knows whether she can let go. "You are here," she said. "That is enough for now." Garrett reached into his coat and pulled out 2 documents. The first was a single sheet of paper bearing Doc Whitaker's signature and an official county seal pressed into red wax. A medical affidavit. Clara took it and read, "I, Dr. James Whitaker, practicing physician of Boulder Creek, Montana Territory, do hereby certify that Eleanor Rose Holden and her daughter Beatrice Holden were stricken with diphtheria in November of 1875. Mr. Garrett Holden was absent at the time of Mrs. Holden's death, having traveled at her explicit request to purchase medicine unavailable in Boulder Creek. In my professional medical opinion, the disease had progressed beyond the reach of any available treatment prior to Mr. Holden's departure. No action or inaction by Mr. R. Holden contributed to or could have prevented the death of his wife. Any suggestion to the contrary is without medical basis and is false." Clara looked at Doc Whitaker. The old man stood with his hands deep in his coat pockets and his chin tucked against the wind. He met her eyes without flinching, though the effort of it showed in the tightness around his mouth. "Should have written that 3 years ago," Doc said. Fear makes cowards of us. Marsh has had his fingers in this town so long, most of us forgot we had spines. The second document was a homestead land claim. Garrett had ridden to the county recorder's office and filed a formal petition for the cabin and the surrounding 160 acres. Stamped, dated, signed by the territorial clerk. Not full ownership yet. That would take years of improvement and proof of habitation. But it was legal. It was on record. It gave Clara and Bess an address, a home recognized by the territory of Montana. You did this for the hearing, Clara said. I did this because it should have been done a long time ago. Garrett's voice was steady. A man ought to put his name on the place he means to stay. Clara turned to Lenora. The old woman had dismounted the mule and was standing on the frozen ground looking at the cabin and the mountains and the vast white emptiness of Montana with the expression of a woman who had lived her entire life in the brick and cobblestone of Boston and was not entirely certain the sky was supposed to be this large. You came, Clara said. Her voice broke on the second word. Lenora reached into the satchel she carried and withdrew three things. The first was a leather-bound journal, identical to the one Clara had found in her father's medical kit. You have his notes on Herbert's theft, Lenora said. This is the copy. Your father made two. He gave me the second the week before he died. He said if anything happens to me, make sure Clara has this. I did not understand then. I understand now. The second item was a bundle of letters tied with string, two sworn statements, Lenora continued, written by Sarah Polk and Eunice Lamb. They were servants in Herbert's house. They were in the hallway the night Silas Green was killed. They heard Herbert threaten you. They heard him say he would blame you for the murder. They were too afraid to speak while Herbert was in Boston. When I told them he had gone to Montana, they wrote these the same afternoon. Clara held the letters, her father's journal, Doc's affidavit, Garrett's land claim. The pieces of a case that had been scattered across 2,000 miles in 3 years, and the silence of people too afraid to speak and now gathered on a porch in Montana by a man who had ridden 2 days without sleep to collect them. The third thing Lenora handed her was small, a cameo brooch on a thin gold chain. It had belonged to Clara's mother. Clara had thought it lost with everything else Herbert had taken. I kept it, Lenora said. He did not know I had it. I kept it because your mother would have wanted you to wear it when you stood up for yourself. Clara closed her hand around the brooch. The metal was warm from Lenora's body heat. She pressed it against her heart. They gathered inside. Clara and Garrett and Doc and Lenora and Wyatt and Colin, Dorothea Hensley, who arrived an hour later, on her mule with a basket of bread and a face that said she had not come to watch, but to fight. Even Clem Hargrove appeared at the door, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable in the way of a man who has been wrong about something and has come to stand on the right side of it without quite knowing how to announce his arrival. They sat around the table. Clara spread her papers. She talked through her case point by point the way her father had taught her to present a diagnosis. Symptoms first, then evidence, then the conclusion the evidence demanded. Doc listened with his arms crossed. Dorothea nodded at intervals that corresponded to facts she could confirm. Lenora sat straight as a judge herself, her eyes bright with the particular fury of a woman who has been patient for too long. Garrett sat still, his hands on his knees, his eyes on Clara, and on his face was something that had moved past admiration into territory that did not have a name in the vocabulary of a man who showed love through fence posts and firewood and 6-hour rides through killing storms. When Clara finished, Doc Whitaker leaned back in his chair. There is one more thing I can offer, he said. His voice had dropped, and his eyes moved to the table as though what he was about to say required him to look at something that could not look back. 2 years ago, a young woman named Sarah Willows came to my office in the middle of the night. She had been working for Herbert Marsh. Bookkeeping, he told her. When she discovered discrepancies in his accounts, she confronted him. He beat her. Her face was swollen. Her arm was sprained. She had marks on her neck consistent with strangulation. She told me Marsh said no one leaves. She believed he would kill her. The room went still, not the quiet of an empty space, but the dense charged silence of a place where something has shifted and everyone knows it. I gave her money from my own pocket, Doc continued. I put her on a freight wagon, heading east before dawn. I told no one because I was afraid of what Marsh could do to me, to my practice, to this town. He paused. His hands were shaking, but his voice was not. I was a coward. I am telling the truth now because there is a woman in this room who deserves better than my silence. Dorothea reached across the table and gripped the old man's hand. Clara looked at him. At this man who had carried his fear like a stone in his pocket for 2 years and had finally set it down. Thank you, she said. I will say ye. Doc nodded once and looked out of the window at the mountains, and something in his posture suggested that the view looked different to him now than it had that morning. That evening, after Doc and Lenora had been settled in the barn, with blankets and hot coffee after Dorothea and Clem had ridden back toward town after Bess had fallen asleep with her hand curled around the cloth doll that had belonged to her mother, Clara sat on the porch with Garrett. The sky was clear in the west and clouded in the east, and the stars showed through the gap like lanterns in a window very far away. "Are you ready?" he asked. "No," she said, "but I am going anyway." He almost smiled. "That is the only kind of ready that matters." She leaned into him. His arm came around her shoulders. They sat together in the cold and watched the dark and did not speak about what the morning would bring, because giving shape to fear would have made it heavier, and they could not afford to carry anything more into that courtroom than they already were. The wedding was held at dawn. Under the cottonwood tree behind the cabin, the first light was breaking over the mountains, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine, and the distant, tentative promise of a season that had not yet arrived, but was thinking about it. There was no preacher, no congregation, no organ music or flower arrangements or anything that the women of Boston's better parlors would have recognized as a proper ceremony. There was only a clearing in the snow, a tree with bare branches beginning to show the faintest swelling of new buds, and two people who had found each other in the ruins of the lives they had been given and decided to build something from the wreckage. Dorothea stood as witness on one side, her eyes red, her jaw clenched against feelings she was not accustomed to displaying in public. Clem Hargrove stood on the other, his new hat in his hands, looking as uncomfortable as a man can look, while simultaneously looking deeply unmistakably moved. Doc Whitaker performed the ceremony. He had the legal authority, he said, as a territorial official. Whether this was strictly true, no one questioned. The moment did not require strict truth. It required the kind of truth that lives in the eyes of two people looking at each other with nothing left to hide. Garrett took Clara's hands, rough on rough, callous on callous. The hands of two people who had spent their lives gripping things that were trying to slip away and had finally found something worth holding. "I give you all I have," he said. "These hands, this land, my name, my word. I will not leave." His voice did not shake. His eyes did not leave hers. Clara spoke. Her voice was clear as the creek that ran behind the cabin, the one that would thaw in spring and murmur all summer long. "I have known loss," she said. "I have known the kind of silence that fills your bones and makes you wonder if you will ever hear anything again. But with you, I hear life. I hear Bess laughing in the morning. I hear the fire when I wake. I hear your boots on the porch when you come home. I am not afraid of the road ahead. I will walk it with you." Bess stepped forward. In her hands she held something small, a flower, purple, barely larger than a thumbnail, dried and pressed flat between two pages of the Bible that sat on the shelf above the stove. The first wildflower of spring found by the creek 2 weeks earlier, the only spot of color in a world still locked in white. She placed it between their joined hands. Garrett looked at the flower, then at his daughter. His jaw tightened and his eyes shone, and for a moment the granite cracked, and what lay beneath it was not stone at all, but something living and tender and desperately glad to see the sun. "So we remember the first sign of spring," Bess said. Her voice was small but certain. Clara and Garrett knelt together. They placed the flower in a shallow hole they had scraped at the base of the cottonwood. They covered it with earth and pressed the soil flat with their palms, a flower buried where a family began. Wyatt cleared his throat. Cole looked at the sky. Lenora wept openly and without apology. And Clem Hargrove, who had ridden into this clearing 2 weeks ago, asking, "What are you thinking?" stood with his hat over his heart and said nothing, because some moments are too large for a man who has spent his life making himself small. The courthouse stood on the south side of the town square in Boulder Creek, a plain building of whitewashed wood with a flat roof and a flagpole where the territorial flag hung limp in the windless morning. It was the most official structure in town, which was not saying much, but it carried a gravity that came from the things that happened inside it. Lives weighed, futures decided. Justice attempted, if not always achieved. The courtroom was full. Word had traveled the way it always does in small places carried by gossip and boredom, and the genuine human need to witness the moments when ordinary people are forced to become something more. Ranchers filled the back benches. Shopkeepers stood along the walls. Women from the church auxiliary occupied one side, and their husbands, uncomfortable in clean shirts, occupied the other. Edna Pruitt sat in the front row, her back straight as a rifle barrel, her cameo at her throat radiating the satisfaction of a woman who believes the verdict has already been written, and she is the one who wrote it. Herbert Marsh sat at the plaintiff's table on the right. Beside him was a thin man with spectacles and a stack of documents who had been hired from Helena to argue the case. Herbert himself was dressed in his best suit, his hair oiled, his face scrubbed to a pink that might have passed for health if you did not look at his eyes. His eyes were the same ones Clara had seen in that office in Boston, the eyes of a man who calculated before he felt and would not have recognized the difference if it had been explained to him. Deputy Wade Buckley sat near the back door, his hand resting on his holstered pistol, with the casual proximity of a man reminding the room that he was armed. He did not look at Clara when she entered. He looked at the floor. Clara walked to the respondent's table on the left. She carried no briefcase, no legal volumes. She had a stack of papers tied with kitchen string and the stub of a pencil in her pocket, and the cameo brooch her mother had worn pinned at her throat. Garrett sat behind her in the gallery. Doc Whitaker 3 rows back clutching his medical bag. Dorothea near the door with Clem beside her. Lenora Price in the second row, her Boston clothes out of place among the wool and denim, her posture so erect she looked like she might stand up and object to something before the proceedings even began. And Bess, sitting in Lenora's lap, watching everything with those gray eyes that missed nothing. Wyatt and Cole flanked the gallery like sentinels. Their faces were freshly shaved. Their shirts were clean. Their boots, for the first time since Clara had known them, had been polished. They sat with the contained stillness of men who understood that what was about to happen in this room mattered more than anything they could do with their hands, and that the waiting was harder than any work. Judge Amos Pruitt entered through a side door. He was tall and thin in the way that age makes men thin, with white hair and a jaw that had been set in concrete sometime around 1840 and had not softened since. He wore no robe, just a dark coat and a white shirt, and an expression that suggested he had seen everything the territory had to offer in the way of human failing and had not yet been surprised. He sat behind the bench, surveyed the room, struck his gavel once. "We are here on 2 matters. A warrant for extradition filed by Mr. Herbert Marsh of Boston, Massachusetts, seeking the return of Clara Whitfield Holden for questioning in the death of Silas Green, and a petition by Mr. Marsh for control of the estate of the late Dr. Thomas Whitfield." He looked at Clara. "Mrs. Holden, you have no legal counsel." "No, sir, I will speak for myself." A murmur moved through the courtroom. Pruitt silenced it with a look that could have frozen the creek in July. The hired man from Helena presented Herbert's case first. He was efficient and bloodless, and he laid out the facts with the mechanical precision of a man assembling a clock. Clara Whitfield had been present at the scene of Silas Green's murder. She had been found with the victim's blood on her clothing. She had fled Boston without cooperating with authorities. Mr. Marsh, as the victim's employer and a respected attorney, sought her return to face questioning. Additionally, as executor of the Whitfield estate, Mr. Marsh petitioned for continued control of assets currently frozen by Clara's disappearance. The man placed the wanted notice on the judge's bench. Clara's name printed in bold letters. The reward amount, the word murder. Pruitt studied the document. Then he looked at Clara. "Your response, Mrs. Holden." Clara stood. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against the table until they stopped. Then she picked up her papers and stepped forward. "Your Honor, Herbert Marsh accuses me of killing Silas Green. I did not kill him. I watched Herbert Marsh kill him." The room stirred. Clara did not pause. "On the evening of November the 3rd, 1878, I went to Herbert Marsh's office on Beacon Street in Boston to retrieve a medical textbook that had belonged to my father. I opened the door and found Silas Green slumped across the desk with a letter opener buried between his shoulder blades. Herbert Marsh was standing beside him. He had just withdrawn the blade. He was wiping it on the dead man's jacket. She let the courtroom hear the silence. Let it feel the weight of what she was describing. Silas Green was Herbert's bookkeeper. My father, Dr. Thomas Whitfield, died 3 months earlier. Herbert inherited everything because the law does not allow a daughter to inherit when a male relative exists. But Herbert was not satisfied with what the law gave him. He had been stealing from my father's estate for 2 years before my father died. Silas Green discovered the theft and threatened to go to the police. Herbert killed him to keep him quiet. She held up her father's journal. The room leaned forward. This is my father's handwriting, his personal journal. He documented every dollar Herbert Marsh diverted from the family accounts over a period of 24 months. Dates, amounts, account numbers, corresponding bank records. My father knew. He was building a case. He died before he could use it. Herbert killed the only other man who had discovered the same truth. She placed the journal on the bench. Herbert told me I had two choices. Marry his associate, Marcus Blackwell, a man of 52, whose two previous wives both died within a year of marriage. Or Herbert would go to the police and tell them I had killed Silas. My dress was covered in the dead man's blood. I was standing over his body. I was a woman alone with no money and no advocate. He knew exactly who would be believed. She paused again, looked at Herbert. His face had changed. The controlled, pleasant expression he had worn like a well-fitted mask was beginning to show fractures. Beneath it, something gray and rigid was emerging, like bone showing through a wound. I chose neither, Clara continued. I ran. I came to Montana. I answered an advertisement placed by a rancher who needed a wife with medical training to care for his sick daughter. I came here not to hide from justice, but to escape a murderer who had made himself the law. She turned toward the gallery. Mrs. Price, would you step forward? Lenore Price stood. She walked to the front of the courtroom with the steady gait of a woman who had carried heavy things her whole life and had no intention of setting them down now just because her knees ached and her back hurt and she was a long way from home. Mrs. Price, Clara said, you were my father's nurse for 12 years. Tell the court what happened the night of November 3rd. Lenore spoke clearly. She told about Clara arriving at her door after midnight, the blood on the dress, the shaking hands, the terror in her eyes. She told about a woman in shock, a woman who had witnessed violence, not committed it. She told about giving Clara money in a newspaper and telling her to run. I have known Clara Whitfield since she was 10 years old, Lenore said. She has her father's hands and her father's heart. She is not capable of murder. She is capable of saving lives. That is what Thomas Whitfield taught her to do, and that is what she has been doing since she arrived in this territory. Clara placed the sworn letters from the two servants on the bench. Sarah Polk and Eunice Lamb. They were in the hallway of Herbert's house that night. They heard him threaten me. They heard him say he would blame me for the killing. They were afraid to speak while he was in Boston. They are speaking now. Pruitt read the letter slowly. His face gave nothing away. Clara looked at Doc Whitaker. The old man was already rising from his seat as if he had been waiting for this moment, the way a man waits for a tide he knows is coming and cannot stop. Your Honor, Doc said, I have something to add. Approach. Doc walked to the front of the courtroom. He set his medical bag on the floor. He straightened his back with a visible effort that cost him something in the spine but gained him something larger in the eyes. In October of 1876, a young woman named Sarah Willows came to my office at 2 a.m. She had been working for Herbert Marsh. When she found irregularities in his financial records, she confronted him. He beat her. Her face was bruised, her left arm was sprained, and she had marks on her neck that were consistent with manual strangulation. She told me Marsh said that no one leaves. She said she believed he would kill her. His voice was steady. His hands were not. I gave her money from my own pocket. I put her on a freight wagon before dawn. I told no one. He paused. I told no one because I was afraid. Afraid of Marsh. Afraid of what he could do to me and to this town. I was a coward for 2 years. I am telling the truth now because there is a woman standing in this courtroom with more courage in her smallest finger than I have shown in my entire life. She deserves better than the silence of men who knew the truth and kept it in their pockets like loose change. The courtroom was absolutely still. Not the quiet of a room where nothing is happening. The dense electric stillness of a room where everything is happening at once and no one dares to breathe for fear of missing it. Herbert Marsh's face had gone the color of old ash. The hired man from Helena was staring at his papers as though they contained instructions for a situation that had sailed far beyond contract law into waters no one had charted. Deputy Buckley had removed his hand from the vicinity of his pistol and was studying the floor with the intensity of a man who wished it would open and swallow him. Clara spoke again. Your Honor, I would also like to present this. She placed Garrett's homestead petition on the bench, a formal land claim for 160 acres, filed with the county recorder, stamped and dated. The cabin where I live with my husband and his daughter is on legally filed land. My stepdaughter has a roof over her head, food in her belly, and medical care that has improved her health in ways that are documented and measurable. I have built a life here, not a hiding place. A life. She did not gesture toward Garrett. She did not need to. The room knew who she meant. Pruitt examined the homestead document. Then he looked up. Is there anyone else who wishes to address the character of Mrs. Holden and the welfare of this household? Clem Hargrove stood. He had been sitting near the back with his hat in his lap, looking like a man trying to swallow something considerably larger than his throat. He walked to the front of the courtroom and stood before the judge, with his shoulders squared and his hands at his sides, and his face the particular shade of red that comes from feeling too much and having no practice expressing it. Your Honor, I work for Garrett Holden, have for 4 seasons. When he first brought Mrs. Holden to the cabin, I thought he had lost his mind. More mouths to feed in a hard winter. I said as much to his face. He paused, looked at Clara, then back at the judge. I was wrong. I have watched that woman fix a fence in a blizzard with her bare hands bleeding through her gloves. I have seen her sit up all night with a 6-year-old child who could not breathe, mixing medicines and changing compresses and never once losing her composure. I have eaten meals she cooked when I know for a fact she went without so the rest of us could have full plates. His voice roughened. He swallowed. That little girl, Bess Holden, she lost her mother 3 years ago. She stopped talking, stopped laughing, stopped doing anything but staring at the wall. Since Clara came, that child has laughed again, has eaten without being forced, has gone outside to play in the snow for the first time in years. If this court needs someone to say that Clara Holden is fit to care for that child and to stand on that land and to be called a citizen of this territory, then I am saying it. And I will swear to it on anything you put in front of me. Clem sat down, put his hat on his head, stared straight ahead, did not look at anyone. His face was the color of a forge. The courtroom was quiet for a long time after that. Even Edna Pruitt had lost the satisfied expression she had worn like a second cameo all morning. She was looking at her husband on the bench with an uncertainty Clara had never seen on her face before, the uncertainty of a woman who has been very sure of something for a very long time and is beginning to suspect she was wrong. Judge Pruitt sat still for a full minute. He looked at the papers spread before him, the wanted notice, the journal, the letters, the affidavit, the land claim, the testimony of a doctor and a nurse and a ranch hand who had nothing to gain from lying and everything to lose from the truth. He looked at Herbert Marsh, whose face had not recovered its color. He looked at Clara, standing alone at her table with kitchen string around her documents and a pencil stub in her pocket and her mother's cameo at her throat. Then he looked at Bess, sitting in Lenora's lap, watching the proceedings with those gray eyes, breathing softly, alive and warm and unaware that her future was being decided by a man with a gavel in a room full of strangers. I have heard sufficient testimony to render judgment on both matters, Pruitt said. On the matter of the extradition warrant, the court finds that the evidence presented does not support the charge against Mrs. Clara Holden. The testimony of multiple witnesses supported by documented financial records maintained by the late Dr. Thomas Whitfield establishes that Mr. Herbert Marsh had clear motive to kill Silas Green and has subsequently used the legal system to pursue the sole witness to that crime. The extradition warrant is denied. He paused. Furthermore, the testimony of Dr. Whitaker regarding the assault on Sarah Willows, combined with the pattern of coercion and fraud documented in Dr. Whitfield's journal, raises questions of sufficient gravity to warrant a formal investigation by the territorial marshal. Mr. Marsh is to be detained pending that investigation. Deputy Buckley is suspended from duty, effective immediately pending review of his conduct. 2 ranchers who had been deputized that morning by Pruitt's order moved toward Herbert. He stood. His face was a mask. Not anger, not fear. The blank expression of a man whose calculations have failed for the first time and who has not yet devised a new equation. For one moment, his eyes found Clara's across the courtroom. What she saw in them was not hatred or rage, but something worse. The flat, uncomprehending recognition of a man who has been defeated by someone he considered beneath his notice. They let him out. The door closed behind him. The room exhaled. On the matter of the Whitfield estate, Pruitt continued. The financial records presented by Mrs. Holden provide substantial evidence of mismanagement and potential fraud by the executor. The estate is hereby frozen pending investigation. If the investigation confirms the allegations, all assets will be restored to the rightful heir, Mrs. Clara Holden, daughter of Dr. Thomas Whitfield. He set the gavel down, not with a bang, but with a quiet click that carried more finality than any thunder. Mr. Marsh will face the law in due course, Pruitt said. This court has done what courts are meant to do. It has listened. He looked at Clara for a long moment, and it has heard. The courtroom emptied slowly the way water drains from a basin, in swirls and eddies. People moved past Clara with nods and murmurs. Some of the women who had whispered about her in the street now looked at her with different eyes. Not all of them. Edna Pruitt swept past without a glance, her back rigid, her jaw locked. But others lingered, touched her arm, said small things that carried weight far beyond their sound. Dorothea reached her first, wrapped her arms around Clara, and held on with the fierce, wordless grip of a woman who has spent her life being practical and has just discovered that some moments are too large for practicality. Clem stood at a distance, hat in hand. Clara walked to him. "Thank you," she said. He looked up. His eyes were bright. He shrugged one shoulder the way men do when they are feeling too much and have spent a lifetime never learning what to do about it. "Just told the truth," he said. "That is all." Doc Whitaker was the last to leave. He stood by the courtroom door, his medical bag in hand, looking older than he had that morning, but somehow lighter, as if a weight he had been carrying for 2 years had finally been set on the ground, and he could feel the difference in every bone. Clara took his hand. "You were brave," she said. He shook his head. "You were brave. I was just late." He squeezed her hand. "Take care of that family, Mrs. Holden. You built it. You earned it." Lenora Price waited outside on the courthouse steps. Bess stood beside her, holding the old woman's hand with the easy trust of a child who knows a grandmother when she sees one, even if the word has never been spoken. When Clara came through the door, Lenora pulled her close and whispered in her ear. "Your father is watching," Lenora said. "I am certain of it." Clara held her the way she had wanted to hold her father in his last weeks and could not because his body was too fragile and her grief was too large, and the space between them had been filled with all the things neither of them could say. She held Lenora and let the old woman stand in for every embrace she had missed, and when she finally let go, her eyes were dry, but her heart was full. The ride home was quiet. Bess sat in the back of the wagon with Lenora. The two of them wrapped in the same blanket, the old woman telling the child stories about Boston and about Dr. Thomas Whitfield and about a little girl named Clara who had once been as small as Bess and had grown into someone remarkable. Garrett drove. He had not spoken since they left the courthouse. His hands on the reins were steady. His face was calm. But something was gathering behind his eyes, something that had been waiting for the right moment. Halfway home, where the road passed through a stand of cottonwoods, and the snow had begun to melt into patches of brown earth and the first fragile suggestions of green, he pulled the wagon to a stop. Clara looked at him. He set the brake, wrapped the reins, climbed down, walked around to her side of the wagon, and stood looking up at her with the trees behind him and the sky above, and the first real warmth of the changing season touching the air. In the courthouse, he said, "I told you that marrying was a legal solution, that it would protect you and Bess." That was true, but it was not the reason. Clara did not move. She watched him from the wagon seat and felt something shift inside her chest, slow and deep, the way the earth shifts when something frozen for a very long time finally begins to thaw. "I want to be with you," he said, "not because of law, not because you need protection, not because I owe you or you owe me. Because this life, this cabin, this land, the sound of your voice when you sing to Bess at night, the way you laugh when you think nobody is listening. It is everything I told myself I would never have again. And I was wrong to tell myself that." He looked at his hands, then back at her. I do not have a ring. I do not have much of anything that the world would call valuable, but I have this land and these hands and whatever time God gives me, and I want to spend it beside you. Not behind you, not in front of you. Beside you, Clara climbed down from the wagon. She stood before him. I do not need you to save me, she said. Her voice was steady, her eyes were clear. I know, you saved yourself. I watched you do it. I need you to stay. I will not go anywhere. I would die before I left. She looked at him for a long time, at the scar on his eyebrow and the lines around his eyes, and the hands that had built a cabin and a barn and a fence line that stretched across the ridge. She saw the man who had ridden 6 hours through a blizzard for a child that was his, and for a woman who was becoming his. The man who slept in a separate room for weeks to protect her reputation. The man who had knelt beside a small bed and tucked a blanket around a sick girl's chin with fingers too gentle for a man his size. Then marry me because you want to, she said. Not because of a courtroom. Not because of a contract. Because you want to, I want to, he said. More than I have wanted anything since the day I forgot how to want. She stepped forward. He stepped forward. And in the middle of a muddy road between melting snow and bare cottonwoods, with Bess watching from the wagon bed, and Lenora pretending not to watch, they kissed for the first time. It was soft and sure and unhurried, the kiss of two people who had lost everything and found each other and understood that what they were building was not a fire but a hearth. The kind of warmth that does not blaze and fade, but holds steady through the long nights and the hard years and the ordinary days that make up a life. In the back of the wagon, Bess smiled, a real smile, the kind she had not worn since before her mother died. She leaned against Lenora and whispered something, and the old woman smiled too, and the whole road seemed warmer for it. 5 years passed. The cabin grew. New walls went up, then new rooms, then a proper porch with posts that did not sag, and a railing garret built from cedar that smelled sweet in the rain. The barn doubled in size. The fence line extended across the north ridge and down to the creek. The herd grew from 40 head to 60. A chicken coop appeared, then a smokehouse, then a garden where Clara planted cabbage and carrots and the wild purple flowers that Bess brought home from the creek bed every spring. Bess was 11 now, tall and serious, incapable in the way of people who learned responsibility before they learned to play. She read every book she could find, borrowing from Dorothea's store and from the traveling library that came through Boulder Creek twice a year. She could identify every herb in Clara's medicine cabinet by smell alone, and she had begun keeping a journal, writing in it each night, with the careful hand of a girl who had decided she would be a doctor someday, like the grandfather she had never met. Her lungs were stronger. Not perfect. They would never be what they should have been. But Clara's treatments maintained daily for 5 years, with the stubborn consistency of a woman who refused to accept what could not be changed, had given Bess a life that Doc Whitaker called a small miracle performed by ordinary stubbornness. Bess could run now, could laugh without coughing, could stand in the spring wind with her arms spread wide and fill her chest with mountain air, and not think about whether her next breath would come. Clara and Garrett had 2 children of their own. Hannah was 3. Black-haired and loud and fearless, she had entered the world in the cabin with Doc Whitaker attending, and Bess holding the lantern, and she had announced her arrival with a scream that suggested she already had opinions about the accommodations. Thomas was one, named for the man who had died in a rented room in Boston and never got to see what his daughter would build from the ruins he left behind. Baby Thomas had Garrett's gray eyes and Clara's stubborn chin, and he had recently learned to say one word with perfect clarity: Papa. He said it every time Garrett walked through the door, and every time Garrett stopped whatever he was doing and lifted the boy against his chest with the same tenderness he had shown the first night Clara arrived, when he knelt beside his sick daughter's bed with the desperate, silent prayer of a father who had run out of everything except love. Wyatt had married a quiet woman named Ada who seemed to communicate primarily through baked goods, and the occasional devastating observation delivered so softly you had to lean in to hear it. They had a son, Calvin, 4 years old, who played with Bess and came home covered in mud, and the particular satisfaction of a child who has spent the day doing exactly what he wanted. Cole was not married, but Dorothea Hensley had begun finding reasons to ride up to the cabin with increasing frequency, bringing supplies that no one had ordered and staying for coffee that no one had offered, and looking at Cole with an expression that everyone in the household could read except apparently Cole himself. Or perhaps he could read it and was simply taking his time the way he took his time with everything gentle and unhurried and certain. Clem Hargrove still came each season. He brought his wife Nell, now a sturdy woman with red hair and a laugh that could be heard across the valley. Clem no longer squinted at Clara with suspicion. He greeted her with a nod that contained the entire history of a man who had been wrong about someone and had spent years being right about them to make up for it. Doc Whitaker came quarterly to check the children. He was slower now, his hands less steady, his steps more careful on the frozen ground. But his eyes were sharp and his spine was straight, and he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had found his courage late and was determined never to misplace it again. Lenora Price had stayed. She had intended to return to Boston after the hearing, but Montana had a way of keeping people who came to it with open hands, and Lenora's hands had been open her entire life. She lived in a small room Clara and Garrett had built onto the cabin, and she spent her days teaching Bess to read medical texts and telling the younger children stories about their grandfather, and making bread that was, Wyatt admitted grudgingly, almost as good as his. Edna Pruitt had not spoken to Clara in 5 years. Clara did not mind. Some doors are better left closed. Herbert Marsh had been tried and convicted. The territorial marshal's investigation, bolstered by Clara's father's journal, by Doc Whitaker's testimony, by the sworn statements from Boston, and by the physical evidence collected from Herbert's office, where Silas Green's blood still stained the rug, had resulted in a sentence that would keep Herbert in a territorial prison for the rest of his natural life. The Whitfield estate had been restored to Clara. She used part of it to build a proper clinic in Boulder Creek, the first medical facility the town had ever had. The rest she put into a fund for Bess's education in the name of Dr. Thomas Whitfield, who had believed his daughter could do anything and had been right. On a warm evening in late spring, Clara stood at the cabin door and watched her children play in the yard. 5 of them now, if you counted Calvin, and Clara always counted Calvin, because family was not a matter of blood, but of showing up. 5 voices, 5 sets of running feet, 5 reasons to wake up each morning and keep building. She reached out and touched the cottonwood tree. It had grown taller and broader in 5 years, its roots deep, its branches spreading wide enough to shade the entire porch in summer. Somewhere beneath it, pressed into the earth, was a dried purple flower that a girl of 6 had placed between 2 scarred hands on a morning when the world decided to begin again. That flower had not survived, of course. Flowers do not live in the ground that way. But something else had grown in its place. A small bush of wild purple blossoms that appeared each spring at the base of the tree, as though the earth remembered what had been planted there and had decided to honor it in its own way. Garrett came up behind her, his arms circled her waist, his chin rested on her shoulder. He smelled of pine sap and leather and the sweet cedar of the porch railing he had just finished sanding. Clara thought about Boston, about the office on Beacon Street, about standing in that room with blood on her dress and nothing in her hands, in the absolute certainty that her life was over. She thought about a train, about a stagecoach, about a clearing in the snow and a cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, and a man who said welcome home to a woman he had never met. She thought about a child who would not look at her, who turned her face to the wall, who reached out one night in the dark and placed a hand on Clara's shoulder like a bird landing on a branch it was not yet sure would hold. She thought about all of it, every mile, every choice, every moment of terror and doubt and exhaustion, and the slow, stubborn accumulation of days that had turned into weeks, that had turned into year, that had turned into this evening, this porch, this man's arms around her. This life, you remember, she asked. Garrett did not need to ask what. The first time you wrote that advertisement. Medical knowledge preferred. You were looking for someone to heal Bess. I was looking for someone to save my daughter, Garrett said. His voice was quiet, steady, warm in a way it had not been 5 years ago, when the words came out of him like stones pulled from frozen ground. I found someone who saved all of us. Clara laughed, a full laugh, open and warm and unafraid. Not the short, startled sound she had made that first winter when something caught her off guard. This was the laugh of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side with her hands full and her heart intact. But you can still carry them, she asked. There are more of them now. Garrett looked out at the yard, at Bess reading to Hannah under the tree, at Thomas chasing the dog Cole had found as a pup, at Calvin throwing stones at a fence post and missing every time, and laughing at each miss as though failure were the funniest thing in the world, at the garden coming up green, at the fence line stretching clean and straight across the ridge, at the clinic in town that bore her father's name, at the life they had built from nothing, from a newspaper advertisement and a blood-stained dress and a $40 gift, from a woman who believed that survival was always worth the price. Always, he said. The wind moved through the valley. It stirred the grass and rustled the cottonwood leaves and carried with it the smell of earth and wildflowers and the smoke from a chimney that stood straight and true. The sky was wide and the mountains were blue, and the road that Clara Whitfield had traveled so long ago stretched empty in the distance, carrying no one, leading nowhere she needed to go. She was already home. Above the clearing, the sky was clean, no clouds, no storms gathering on the horizon. And at the base of the cottonwood tree, the purple flowers bloomed, small and stubborn and certain, the first sign of spring, every year, without fail. The way some things once planted simply refused to stop growing.